The year was 1986. Crack cocaine was spreading through American cities like wildfire, and the media couldn't stop talking about it. Evening news broadcasts showed images of crack vials littering streets, mothers addicted and unable to care for their children, and neighborhoods that seemed to be crumbling overnight. The panic was real, the fear was genuine, and politicians knew they had to act fast. So they did. They passed a law that would change the trajectory of Black America for generations. But not in the way anyone expected. By the mid-1980s, crack cocaine had become the drug of choice in urban America. Unlike powder cocaine, which was expensive and associated with wealthy white users, crack was cheap, accessible, and devastatingly addictive. You could buy a rock for $5. Within seconds of smoking it, users felt an intense euphoric rush, but it lasted only minutes, driving them back for more, again and again, until their lives fell apart. The violence came next. Crack dealers fought turf wars with automatic weapons. Drive-by shootings became common. Innocent children caught stray bullets while playing on their front porches. In cities like Los Angeles, New York, Detroit, and Washington, D.C., homicide rates soared. Hospitals overflowed with gunshot victims and overdose cases. Emergency rooms became war zones. Parents watched their teenage sons get pulled into the drug trade, lured by the promise of quick money. Mothers saw their daughters disappear into addiction, trading anything for the next hit. Entire blocks transformed into open-air drug markets. Abandoned buildings became crack houses where users huddled in darkness, pipes glowing orange in the shadows. The Black community begged for help. Ministers held prayer vigils. Community leaders organized marches. Mothers formed groups to patrol streets and chase dealers away. They wrote letters to Congress pleading for intervention. They wanted their neighborhoods back. They wanted their children safe. They wanted the violence to stop. Congress heard them, and Congress acted. But what came next wasn't salvation. It was devastation. On October 27, 1986, President Ronald Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act into law. The legislation was massive, over 100 pages of new drug enforcement provisions, but buried within those pages was a clause that would destroy Black families for decades to come. A sentencing guideline that seemed logical on the surface, but was actually catastrophically racist in practice. The law established mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. If you were caught with 5 grams of crack cocaine, you received a mandatory 5-year federal prison sentence, no parole, no early release, no judge's discretion. 5 grams. That's about the weight of 5 sugar packets, 5 years in federal prison. But here's where it gets sinister. If you were caught with powder cocaine, you needed 500 grams to trigger that same 5-year sentence. 500 grams versus 5 grams, a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity. The same drug, different form, wildly different punishment. Why did this matter? Because crack cocaine was predominantly used and sold in Black neighborhoods, while powder cocaine was the drug of choice in white suburbs and among wealthy professionals. The law didn't say Black people would be punished more harshly than white people. It didn't have to. The disparity was built into the chemistry. Legislators claimed the harsher sentences for crack were justified because crack was more addictive, more associated with violence, and more destructive to communities. But the science didn't support this. Pharmacologically, crack and powder cocaine are identical. They're the same drug. The only difference is how they're consumed. Crack is smoked. Powder is snorted or injected. The high is the same. The addiction potential is the same. The chemical compound is the same. What wasn't the same was who used it and who went to prison for it. Within months of the law's passage, arrests skyrocketed. Federal agents, local police, and drug task forces flooded Black neighborhoods. They set up sting operations, conducted raids, and made arrest after arrest after arrest. Young Black men were hauled off in handcuffs, many of them first-time offenders, some caught with amounts small enough to fit in a wallet. A teenager caught selling a few rocks to support his family got 5 years. A college student caught with crack at a party got 5 years. A father struggling with addiction caught with enough for personal use got 5 years. There was no room for context, no consideration of circumstances. The law was mandatory, and the prison doors swung wide open. By 1988, 2 years after the law passed, Black Americans made up about 12% of the U.S. population, but accounted for nearly 40% of those incarcerated in state and federal prisons. By the early 1990s, that number climbed higher. 1 in 3 black men in their 20s was either in prison, on probation, or on parole. In some cities, the rate was even worse. In Baltimore, nearly half of young black men were tangled in the criminal justice system. The arrests didn't just target dealers. Low-level offenders, lookouts, runners, and users were swept up too. Conspiracy laws meant that if you were anywhere near a drug transaction, even if you didn't touch the drugs, you could be charged as an accomplice and face the same mandatory minimums. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time could cost you 5, 10, 20 years of your life. Police descended on housing projects with warrants, battering down doors, searching apartments, dragging fathers and sons away while mothers and children screamed. Entire families watched as their providers, their protectors, their loved ones were taken, shoved into police cars, and driven off to processing centers that fed directly into the prison pipeline. The fear was constant. Any knock on the door could be the police. Any phone call could be news of an arrest. Mothers warned their sons not to stand on certain corners, not to talk to certain people, not to even look like they were involved. But in neighborhoods where crack was everywhere, avoiding it completely was nearly impossible. The most immediate and visible impact was the disappearance of fathers. Black men were incarcerated at rates never seen before in American history. Entire generations of children grew up without their fathers in the home, not because their fathers abandoned them, but because the state took them away. A man caught with crack in 1987 wouldn't come home until 1992, 1997, sometimes 2002 or later. By the time he was released, his children were teenagers who barely remembered him. His partner had moved on or was struggling alone. His job was long gone. His community had changed. He came home to a world that had moved forward without him, and he was expected to reintegrate as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. While he was locked away, his daughter had her first period and didn't have him to protect her. His son got jumped at school and didn't have him to teach him how to fight back. His mother got sick and didn't have him to take care of her. Birthdays passed, holidays came and went, milestones were missed, all because of 5 grams. Children growing up without fathers faced documented consequences. They were more likely to drop out of school, more likely to experience poverty, more likely to engage in risky behavior, and more likely to end up incarcerated themselves. The cycle perpetuated itself. Sons watched their fathers get arrested and later found themselves in the same position, handcuffed and sentenced under the same laws. Single mothers carried impossible burdens. They worked 2 jobs, raised multiple children alone, and navigated a world that judged them for their partner's absence. The economic strain was crushing. Fathers who had contributed income, childcare, and stability were gone. Rent became harder to pay. Food became scarcer. Bills piled up. Some women turned to welfare, which came with its own stigma and restrictions. Others relied on extended family, moving in with grandparents or siblings, cramming multiple families into small apartments. The stress fractured relationships. Depression set in. Some women struggled with substance abuse themselves, trying to numb the pain of doing it all alone. When fathers were released, they returned broken. Prison had hardened them, traumatized them, disconnected them from the people they loved. Re-entry programs were scarce. Job opportunities were non-existent. A felony conviction meant you couldn't get public housing, couldn't get student loans, couldn't vote in many states, and couldn't pass a background check for most jobs. Society made it nearly impossible to rebuild. Many fathers wanted desperately to reconnect with their children, but the gap was too wide. Years of absence couldn't be bridged with a phone call or a visit. Trust had to be rebuilt from scratch, and time had run out. Some men gave up. Others fell back into the drug trade, because it was the only economy that would accept them. And when they did, they were arrested again, sentenced again, disappeared again. As men were incarcerated in staggering numbers, the economic foundation of black neighborhoods crumbled. These weren't just individuals being removed. They were workers, earners, consumers, and contributors to local economies. When tens of thousands of black men disappeared into prisons, the money disappeared with them. Businesses that had served these communities for decades began to close. Barber shops lost customers. Corner stores lost foot traffic. Restaurants and diners shut down. The money that had circulated within the neighborhood, supporting black-owned businesses and keeping local economies alive, dried up. Property values plummeted. Buildings fell into disrepair. Landlords stopped investing in maintenance because the tenants couldn't afford higher rents. At the same time, the crack epidemic itself was destroying economic opportunities. Entire blocks became too dangerous for legitimate businesses to operate. Store owners installed bars on windows, hired armed security, or simply left. Banks redlined neighborhoods, refusing to offer loans or mortgages to residents in areas deemed high risk. This made it impossible for families to buy homes, start businesses, or build generational wealth. The job market collapsed too. Factories that had once employed black workers closed or moved to suburbs. Manufacturing jobs, which had provided stable middle-class incomes, vanished. What replaced them were low-wage service jobs with no benefits, no security, and no future. Young men who might have worked in factories found themselves with no options except fast food, temporary labor, or the streets. The streets became an economy unto themselves. Crack dealing offered what legitimate work could not: quick money, respect, and a sense of power. Boys as young as 12 became lookouts and runners. Teenagers became dealers. Young men became distributors. The drug trade filled the vacuum left by the disappearance of legal work, and it paid better than anything else available. But the money made from crack didn't build wealth. It didn't fund college educations or down payments on homes. It was fast money, dangerous money, money that came with violence and incarceration. It didn't lift communities up, it tore them apart. As neighborhoods destabilized, schools suffered catastrophically. Children who grew up in homes fractured by incarceration came to school traumatized, angry, and unable to focus. Teachers, overwhelmed and underfunded, struggled to reach students carrying the weight of missing fathers, poverty, and violence. Test scores plummeted. Dropout rates soared. School districts responded not with support, but with punishment. Zero-tolerance policies emerged in the 1990s, inspired by the same tough-on-crime mentality that created the sentencing disparity. Students caught fighting, talking back, or skipping class were no longer sent to the principal's office. They were arrested. School resource officers, armed police stationed in hallways, became common in predominantly black schools. Minor infractions that once resulted in detention now resulted in handcuffs. A teenager who threw a paper ball could be charged with assault. A student who cursed at a teacher could be arrested for disorderly conduct. The school-to-prison pipeline was born, a direct descendant of the 1986 law. Kids who should have been learning algebra were learning how the criminal justice system worked firsthand. By the time these students reached adulthood, many had criminal records that followed them forever. A juvenile arrest for a schoolyard fight meant they couldn't get into college, couldn't pass a background check, couldn't escape the cycle. The pipeline fed itself, generation after generation. Meanwhile, white students caught with powder cocaine faced wildly different consequences. A college kid arrested at a frat party with a bag of cocaine might get probation, community service, or a suspended sentence. His future remained intact. He graduated, got a job, moved on with his life. The disparity wasn't theoretical. It was real, measurable, and devastating. Studies showed that white and black Americans used drugs at roughly the same rates, but black Americans were arrested and incarcerated at rates 5 to 10 times higher. The criminal justice system didn't target behavior. It targeted communities. It targeted zip codes. It targeted skin color. Federal sentencing data from the 1990s revealed that over 80% of people sentenced for crack offenses were black, even though the majority of crack users were white. The law didn't explicitly mention race, but it didn't have to. The results spoke for themselves. Judges, prosecutors, and public defenders all recognized the injustice, but their hands were tied. Mandatory minimums removed judicial discretion. A judge who believed a defendant deserved a second chance had no choice but to impose the mandatory sentence. Some judges resigned in protest. Others spoke out publicly, calling the sentencing disparity unconscionable. But the law remained unchanged for decades. Defense attorneys watched helplessly as their clients, many of them young, non-violent offenders, were sentenced to years behind bars for possessing amounts of crack that wouldn't have triggered any prison time if it had been powder. Families sobbed in courtrooms as sons, fathers, and brothers were led away in shackles. The system processed them like cattle, case after case after case. Prisons swelled beyond capacity. Federal and state facilities built during the 1990s filled immediately. New prisons were constructed at breakneck speed. The United States, with less than 5% of the world's population, housed nearly 25% of the world's prisoners. The majority were black and brown men serving time for non-violent drug offenses. Inside those prisons, men lost years of their lives. They missed weddings, funerals, births, and birthdays. They were denied access to education, job training, and mental health services. They lived in overcrowded cells, sometimes sleeping on floors, eating inadequate meals, and enduring violence from other inmates and guards. The conditions were inhumane, but society didn't care. They were criminals. They deserved it. When these men were finally released, they returned to communities that had been hollowed out by their absence. Entire neighborhoods had lost a generation of men to incarceration. The social fabric was torn beyond repair. Elders who once guided young men were gone. Fathers who once taught their sons how to navigate the world were missing. The knowledge, the wisdom, the stability, all disappeared into prison cells. Young boys growing up in the 1990s and 2000s had no male role models except older boys who had survived the streets. They learned masculinity from peers, from music videos, from hustlers on the corner. They learned that respect came from violence, that manhood meant toughness, that showing emotion was weakness. The culture shifted, hardened by trauma and loss. In 2010, after decades of advocacy, Congress finally passed the Fair Sentencing Act, reducing the crack-to-powder sentencing disparity from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. It was progress, but it wasn't justice. The disparity still existed, and the law wasn't retroactive, meaning the hundreds of thousands of people already serving sentences under the old guidelines remained in prison. It took until 2018 for the First Step Act to make the sentencing reforms retroactive, allowing some inmates to petition for early release. Thousands were freed, many of them elderly men who had spent 20, 30, even 40 years behind bars for nonviolent offenses. They walked out of prison into a world they no longer recognized, equipped with nothing but a bus ticket and $50, but the damage was done. An entire generation had been lost. Families had been destroyed. Neighborhoods had collapsed. The wealth gap between black and white America, already massive, had widened into a chasm. The 1986 law didn't just incarcerate individuals. It incarcerated entire communities, stripping them of fathers, workers, leaders, and hope. Today, the legacy of that law is everywhere. It's in the single-parent household struggling to make ends meet. It's in the underfunded schools with metal detectors at the entrance. It's in the abandoned buildings and shuttered businesses on once vibrant blocks. It's in the men who came home from prison only to find that home no longer existed. It's in the children who grew up without fathers and became fathers themselves, repeating the cycle. The 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act was sold as a solution to the crack epidemic. It was supposed to make communities safer, to protect families, to restore order. Instead, it weaponized the criminal justice system against black America, turning a public health crisis into a mass incarceration disaster. It destroyed neighborhoods, separated families, and inflicted generational trauma that persists to this day. The law has been reformed, but the scars remain. You can change a policy, but you can't undo decades of destruction. You can release prisoners, but you can't give them back the years they lost. You can acknowledge the injustice, but you can't resurrect the communities that were wiped out. This is the story of how one law destroyed black neighborhoods forever, not through accidents or unintended consequences, but through deliberate policy choices that valued punishment over rehabilitation, incarceration over investment, and control over compassion. The crack epidemic required a response, but what black America got wasn't help, it was harm. And nearly 40 years later, the wounds still haven't healed.